What if the fastest way to limit your potential was to define yourself too early? Because when you define yourself, you can also confine yourself. Today, I want to talk about unlocking the other side of you. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. I, like a lot of people, used to love to take personality tests. I thought that they were a really interesting tool to understand yourself better. I thought that they were fun to talk about in teams or to share with your friends, your family, or your partner afterwards as well. But more recently, I've started to view personality tests in a really different way. And this is because of a book that I've recently read, which I'm going to share later in this episode. I've also just come to realize through my own experience that these labels that we put on ourselves through our own self assessments or through personality tests can also be really limiting because they become our permission slip to live within this particular label. And what might have started off as a really nice exercise that helps you to gain self awareness can then turn into a limiting belief about yourself. So, when you are building your personal brand, or when you are just simply trying to expand your identity or your experiences, it's easy to feel like some aspects of that may be inauthentic. But what if you looked at it a different way? And it's not actually about being inauthentic. It's about unlocking this other side of you. It's about unlocking the version of you that people haven't yet had a chance to experience. And that's what I want to break down in today's episode. I want to talk about how you might have potentially been operating in this version of yourself that you may have decided on too soon, and how you can unlock the other side of your potential. Now, the first point that I want to break down is the left brain and the right brain myth. It's likely that at some point during your education or your career, or maybe just in your own personal life, you have either assessed yourself as being left brain or right brain. Maybe you took a test, or maybe you just know which one you tend to lean towards. So if you identify with the left brain label, this implies that you are logical, that you are analytical, that you're structured. If you identify with the right side of your brain, this implies that you are creative, that you might be emotional, and that you are intuitive, for example. So this idea of having either left brain or right brain tendencies originated in the 1960s through split brain research, where neuroscientists studied the brains of people that had undergone split brain surgery. So these were people, for example, that suffered severe epilepsy. And what it found was that the different areas of the brain, so your left brain and your right brain, tended to perform different functions. And these were really fascinating insights at the time. So, for example, your left brain would focus more on language processing and sequential patterns, whereas your right brain would focus on things like your spatial awareness and your pattern recognition. So, at the time, this was actually a really fascinating breakthrough because it showed that different hemispheres of your brain were ladderized. It showed that they performed different functions. But since then, it has often been misinterpreted or overused to put people into these certain boxes. And what is often missed from that conversation is that that research actually applied to very severe clinical cases. They were extreme scenarios. And it is that research that has led people into believing that they are either not a creative person or not a numbers person, for example. And I'm sure that's something that you have heard people around you say, or maybe you've even said it yourself. But what the research has shown since is that your brain isn't just switching between hemispheres, it is constantly synthesizing information. And there was research that was done in 2013 by the University of Utah, so much more recently, that has shown that people aren't actually more dominantly left brain or right brain. It showed that this narrative that we have in popular culture isn't actually as science backed as we might think. Because your brain is this sophisticated system that is constantly communicating through its different areas. And while you might think that certain tasks are either left brain tasks or right brain tasks, they are usually a combination of both. So, for example, something like speaking involves things like language, memory, emotion, and motor control as well. Something that is creative, for example, still draws on both structure and imagination. And things like decision making, for example, blend things like logic with intuition as well. So remember that there is this constant communication that is happening throughout your brain, throughout the neural networks within your brain. And when you define yourself as either being a creative person or a numbers person or a logical person, then you're disregarding all of that amazing potential that one of your most fascinating organs has to offer. You're limiting yourself to believing that you can literally only be using half of your brain when you have this whole other half of your brain that you potentially aren't even trying to unlock. So, what are some of the ways that you can potentially start to unlock the different areas of your brain? One of my favorite suggestions for this is to consider Julia Cameron's idea of morning pages. Now, this is something that I have talked about in a recent episode because I have been doing this for the last year, for over a year now, and it has become one of my absolute favorite habits. This is a very specific form of journaling, and as I talked about in that episode, I've got my own way that I have adapted that as well to make it more sustainable for me personally. And the beauty of morning pages is that it was designed by Julia Cameron to help you to overcome what she describes as the sensor. So, the sensor is that thing that is always trying to keep you safe. So, it's that voice in your head that wants you to stay in certain lanes, for example, instead of exploring new possibilities. And the idea of a morning pages practice is that you can overcome that sensor to actually get to the other side. That is one of the main objectives. It's to have breakthroughs, to get to the other side of what your conscious mind could be thinking. So that is a great way to get into the practice of unlocking the other side of your potential. So let's talk a little bit more about a few little challenges that you can do to expand your identity when it comes to your left brain, right brain thinking that you may have had about yourself. Firstly, you can ask yourself, what have I been telling myself that I am not? So understand that label that you have already put on yourself or the things that you have assumed that you aren't. So maybe, as I said earlier, it's that you've said that you're not a creative person or that you're not a numbers person or a logical person or a structured person or whatever labels you have put on yourself. And then find ways to actively challenge those labels. So, how can you, for example, every day or every week do something that could potentially challenge that perception that you have for yourself? So, what is that idea that you can prove to yourself isn't actually true? Or, for example, another thing that you could do is to switch between either left leaning or right leaning tasks as a part of your daily routine. So, not having to do necessarily both at the same time, but making sure that there is a combination of maybe both as a part of your routine. So, you're building that muscle in that space that you potentially thought wasn't your natural tendency. And also, as a part of those identity expansion challenges, consider if you can start a regular morning pages journaling habit. So this is something that I do every weekday. So it is one of the first things that I do when I wake up in the morning. It is part of my first hour in my morning routine, which I also talked about on an episode recently, talking about how I wake up at 4 a.m. and some of the key activities that I do to try and set up my day for success as a part of that as well. And as I said, morning pages journaling is a habit that I would highly, highly recommend. And I've absolutely loved adding this to my routine more recently too. Now, the second point that I want to talk about is a much more ancient concept, and that is the idea of yin and yang. So, this is an ancient Chinese philosophy, which I'm sure you might have heard of or seen the symbol for. And what is really important to remember about this idea of yin and yang, which I also broke down in an earlier episode that I've done about creating an alter ego, is that yin and yang aren't actually opposing forces or opposites. They're actually partners designed to complement each other. So, for example, the dark side, the yin side, symbolizes dark, moon, water, coolness, softness, femininity, passiveness, and stillness, while the white side represents light, sun, fire, warmth, hardness, masculinity, activeness, and movement. But what is also really important to remember about the yin and yang symbol is that there is a little dot within each side of the opposite color. So there's the little black dot and there's the little white dot. And that is to symbolize that within each side still exists the other side, that they work together, that they are incomplete without each other. So when you're building your personal brand, or when you are expanding in your professional development, remember that sometimes you don't have to be either or. You can choose to be both. So you can be, for example, the technical consultant who is also the creative that publishes content online. Or you can be, for example, someone who is an extroverted public speaker but also be an introverted writer as well. When it comes to your personal brand, remember that the other side of your potential isn't this fake version of yourself. It is just the side of you that maybe you haven't yet unlocked or shared with the rest of the world. And remember that sometimes it is that contrasting side of you that could be the most interesting thing about your personal brand or about the value proposition that you have to offer in the marketplace. And in a recent series that I did on the art of reinvention, I talked about this idea of skill stacking. This is something that I've talked about a lot on this channel recently because I really want to reiterate this point. And it's that skill stacking is coming up with this complementary but rare combination of skills that allows you to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. And as the marketplace starts to get more and more competitive, this is going to be what helps you to build your competitive advantage. So, as another identity expansion challenge, ask yourself, what are the contrasting skills that you potentially have? So, if you think in this almost yin and yang mindset, what are the skills that you know are already very much your lane and that people know you for? But maybe you also have these other contrasting skills that you perhaps haven't actually shared with the world very much yet. And identify what those skills are and where they could potentially be unique in the marketplace. So, what is the combination of skills that you could potentially explore sharing more as a part of your personal brand or as a part of your professional development? And then, what I want you to think about is how you can give yourself a challenge of maybe once a week doing something that is going to share that other side of yourself. And this might not necessarily need to always be the same task every week. These could be different things, but how are you sharing another version of your personality or of your potential and capabilities? So this might be, for example, posting on social media when you perhaps haven't considered yourself a creative person. Or maybe it is something like presenting in a report or in a presentation an aspect of your capabilities that maybe people weren't actually aware of. So maybe if people have thought or you have thought about yourself that you are not a numbers person, that could be an opportunity for you to show that you actually understand the numbers and things like data really well as well, and that you're not just a creative thinker, for example. So as point number 3, I want to emphasize the identity trap of personality tests. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this episode, I used to love personality tests. And I think, like a lot of people, this has a lot to do with the instant clarity that this gives you. It is a quick win for self awareness. You can say things like, I'm an extrovert or I'm an introvert, or more broadly, when you are going about your professional or your personal life, you can say things like, that's just how I am, for example, and not have to actively try and expand your capabilities or push your boundaries, which to me relates back to Carol Dweck's work on having either a fixed mindset or a growth mindset, where you can choose to be defined by these labels and believe in, say, just natural born talent, as you do with a fixed mindset, or you can believe that your talent, your skills, your capabilities, and the outcomes that you are seeking are actually shapeable. That is what a growth mindset is. And when we box ourselves into these labels, that is when we potentially lose sight of our capabilities to have that growth mindset. And this was really reiterated to me in a book that I read recently called Personality Isn't Permanent. And I absolutely loved this book, and I'm going to be talking about it a lot more in another episode as well. But for now, I just want to highlight a couple of my favorite takeaways from this book and begin by saying you are not a single and narrow type of person. In different situations and around different people, you are different. Your personality is dynamic, flexible, and contextual. Moreover, your personality changes throughout your life far more than you can presently imagine. And what he talks about as being much more important than your personality is your psychological flexibility, because that is what is going to help you with your personal transformation. And as a part of the book, he also champions this idea of a keystone goal, which I absolutely love, and why I'm doing a whole other episode on this too. And this is where you are driven by a purpose as opposed to your personality. And this does not need to be about doing something to save the world or having a why that is really socially accepted. This is just a keystone goal that is really important to you. So you are driven by a purpose as opposed to your personality. So for this identity challenge, I want you to think about the labels that you have given yourself as a result of the personality tests that you have taken. And a point that he makes in the book, which I knew about but I had actually forgotten, was that Myers-Briggs, so one of the most popular personality tests in the world, was actually created by writers and researchers. It was a mother-daughter duo that came up with this framework. So I am definitely not one to be an academic elitist in any way, but that is something that is worth noting if you aren't familiar with the background of this framework. And when you identify these labels that you have had for yourself as a result of these personality tests, then also consider how you have actively contradicted those labels. So go back to your past experiences and see where you can provide your brain with proof that those labels maybe weren't entirely accurate, that they didn't actually display the full spectrum of your capabilities. And then, similar to your previous challenge, ask yourself if there is something that you can do every week that is going to allow you to get to the other side of this label, or to build your muscle in the other side of your potential. And my point number 4 is to create an alter ego. Now, if you have been following this channel, you would know that this is one of my favorite topics to discuss at the moment, because I think it is such an underrated strategy that elite performers put into practice daily. They understand the power of an alter ego. It is this second self that you can create for yourself that allows you to perform in high pressure situations. So if you can't see this current version of yourself being able to perform at a particular standard, or in a particular way, or in a particular field, then that's okay, because the alter ego version of you might be able to do that. And I once heard a creator actually describe this, where they were talking about how they were thinking about, a type of content that they wanted to do, and they felt like it wasn't something that they could do. But they had this conversation with themselves where they went, well, that's okay. The alter ego version of themselves can. And that is the potential of your alter ego. It's not this fake performance persona, it is the performance identity that unlocks the capability that is already within you. And as I've mentioned, I've talked about creating an alter ego previously on this channel, but more recently, I became more obsessed with the idea when I read Todd Herman's book, The Alter Ego Effect, which I've recently broken down and shared all of my top takeaways from that book to create an alter ego. So if you haven't seen that episode yet, make sure that you go back and check that out. But some of my favorite quotes from the book is that he says, the process of using an alter ego is not about changing one's fundamental self, but rather about revealing the heroic qualities that are already present within. He also says, I would encourage you to consider your alter ego not as a mask that you put on, but as a mask that you take off as you move closer to your true self. And I love that he says just so succinctly, your alter ego gives you permission to be bold. So if you haven't already, make sure you check out my episode on how to create an alter ego, because it is going to be one of the most impactful ways to step into this second version of yourself. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.